Picture this, you're a soldier entrenched in a fierce battle, your comrades falling all around you. The enemy is closing in, but it's not their guns that you fear. No, it's something much worse, a weapon so powerful, so devastating, it seems like the earth itself is trying to swallow you whole. The sound of it is deafening. The ground shakes as shells explode all around, and all you can do is pray for cover. This isn't an enemy you can see, but one that you know is all around you, American artillery. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that firepower day after day. This was the reality that Japanese soldiers faced in the Pacific War, and the worst part? No matter how many times they tried to stop it, the artillery kept coming. The Marines didn't just fight. They overwhelmed the enemy with relentless force and unshakable determination. If you want to understand the terrifying truth of why American artillery was feared above all else, make sure to hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss this incredible journey into the heart of history, where we dive into the stories of courage, firepower, and unyielding will that changed the course of the war. Now, let's get back to the battlefield. The year was 1945. The Japanese had long been conditioned to believe in the invincibility of their military. They had trained their soldiers to die with honor, to hold their positions at any cost. But they had never encountered an enemy like the U.S. Marines. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima, they were prepared for the fight of their lives. What they didn't know was that they were about to face something far worse than they could have ever imagined: American artillery. It wasn't just the Marines' courage that made them so deadly, it was their overwhelming firepower. While the Japanese were dug in, expecting a long and brutal fight, the Marines had a secret weapon that could break through even the most fortified defenses. That weapon was their artillery, and it didn't stop. Japanese soldiers who had been trained to withstand artillery barrages were stunned by the speed, precision, and unrelenting force of American guns. They had never seen anything like it. The Marines didn't just fire shells. They fired with purpose, with coordination, and with a speed that left the Japanese no time to react. It was a psychological weapon, as much as it was a physical one. The Japanese couldn't escape it, couldn't hide from it. It was relentless, and it wore them down day by day. Now imagine being on the other side of that artillery fire. The Japanese soldiers, brave and dedicated to their cause, had one belief that kept them going: honor. But when they saw the Marines keep coming, no matter how many fell, no matter how much firepower the Japanese unleashed, they started to realize something terrifying. The Americans would not stop. They had no choice but to keep fighting, but the cost was mounting, and they had no way to stop the artillery, no way to silence the relentless barrage. This was the nightmare that haunted Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific War, the American artillery that just wouldn't stop. It was the ultimate force multiplier, the game changer that crushed their defenses and left them with no hope of victory. The Japanese couldn't match the firepower, and they certainly couldn't match the Marines' relentless spirit. And when it came down to it, no matter how many soldiers they lost, the Marines would keep coming, the artillery would keep falling, and the Japanese would never have the chance to regroup, to take back their positions. But what made American artillery so terrifying wasn't just the number of shells fired or the size of the guns. It was the sheer precision and coordination that the Marines brought to the battlefield. They didn't just fire blindly. They knew exactly where to strike, when to strike, and how to maximize the damage. This wasn't just about firepower. It was about skill, and the Marines had it in spades. And that's what made the Marines such a formidable force. They didn't just fight with guns and tanks. They fought with an entire arsenal of tactics, strategies, and overwhelming firepower that the Japanese simply couldn't counter. The Marines didn't just attack. They attacked with the full might of the American military machine behind them. And they didn't stop until the job was done. So why did the Japanese fear American artillery more than anything else? Because it was unstoppable. The artillery didn't care about casualties, didn't care about honor, didn't care about anything except wiping out the enemy. And it did just that, over and over again, until the Japanese had no choice but to accept their fate. But the most terrifying part? The Marines didn't stop. No matter how many times the Japanese tried to break them, no matter how many artillery rounds they fired back, the Marines kept pushing forward. And that's what made them so feared. The Japanese realized too late that no matter how much they fought, The Marines would always come back stronger with more firepower and more determination. If you're captivated by the brutal realities of war and want to dive deeper into these incredible stories of resilience and strategy, make sure to subscribe to our channel now. You won't regret it. There's much more to come, and you don't want to miss a single moment of this gripping journey through history. As the battle raged on, the Marines' commitment to their objectives became more than just a tactical advantage. It became a force of nature. Every wave, every assault, every round of artillery fired was a testament to the unyielding determination of the United States military. And this unrelenting drive wasn't just the result of individual heroism. It was the product of a highly systematic approach to warfare, an approach that the Japanese had underestimated. The Japanese had long prided themselves on their ability to fight with honor, to die for the emperor, and to hold their ground at all costs. But when they faced the U.S. Marines, they encountered a different kind of enemy, one that didn't just fight for survival or honor. They fought to win, and nothing could stop them from achieving their goal. The Marines' training prepared them for the unimaginable. They were taught not just how to fight, but how to endure, how to push through even the most excruciating conditions. It wasn't just about being brave, it was about being relentless. And the secret to their success wasn't just the weapons they carried or the firepower they brought to the table. It was the sheer force of will that kept them fighting no matter the cost. In stark contrast, the Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to expect a brutal, prolonged struggle. Their strategy had been based on the belief that they could break the will of any enemy through sheer force and spirit. But against the Marines, that belief was shattered. The Americans didn't break. They didn't retreat. They didn't even flinch. Take the assault on Iwo Jima, for example. The Japanese had prepared for months, digging in and fortifying their positions. They believed that the Marines would be halted, that the sheer strength of their defenses would be enough to wear down the attackers. But what the Japanese didn't account for was the Marines' ability to fight through anything. They didn't stop when the going got tough. They pushed forward, relying not just on their own willpower, but on the overwhelming firepower of their artillery support. The Japanese had long relied on artillery to defend their positions, and they believed it was their greatest strength. But the American artillery that the Marines called in was something entirely different. It wasn't just about firing shells at a target, it was about precision, speed, and coordination. The Marines had mastered the art of calling in fire support, and when they did, the effects were devastating. Imagine being a Japanese soldier, entrenched in a bunker, watching the American artillery shells explode around you. The earth shakes with each blast, and the air is filled with the deafening roar of exploding shells. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You can hear the whistling of the shells before they land, but by the time you realize it, it's already too late. In those moments, the Japanese soldiers were not just fighting the Marines. They were fighting against an unstoppable force that seemed to know no mercy. This was the psychological toll of American artillery. The Japanese soldiers knew that no matter how hard they fought, no matter how many positions they held, the artillery would always find them. It didn't matter if they had reinforced their positions or dug deeper bunkers. The Marines' artillery could reach them, no matter where they hid. And when the shells started falling, there was no escape. This unrelenting firepower was what the Japanese found so terrifying. Unlike their own artillery, which often relied on sporadic, uncoordinated fire, the American artillery was precise, calculated, and devastating. It wasn't just the number of shells fired, but the way the Americans used them. They could coordinate fire from multiple batteries, hitting the same target from different angles, overwhelming the enemy with firepower that was impossible to counter. And then there was the speed. American artillery could be fired and repositioned at a speed that the Japanese simply couldn't match. While the Japanese were still struggling to reload their guns, the Americans were already moving on to the next target. The speed of American artillery fire was another factor that left the Japanese commanders helpless. They couldn't react fast enough to counter the barrage, and by the time they tried to reposition their own guns, the Marines had already moved on to the next phase of their assault. What made American artillery even more devastating was its ability to adapt to the battlefield. The Japanese, who had been trained to rely on static defenses, found themselves constantly outmaneuvered. The Marines, on the other hand, could adjust their tactics on the fly. If one approach wasn't working, they quickly shifted to another, using artillery to clear a path and tanks to break through fortified positions. The result was an unstoppable combination of firepower and flexibility that the Japanese had no way of countering. The Marines' tactics, backed by overwhelming artillery support, transformed the battlefield. The Japanese were forced to fight a defensive war, constantly trying to hold their ground, but they were always a step behind. The Marines didn't give them the opportunity to regroup or recover. Every time the Japanese thought they had gained an advantage, the Marines would strike back harder, using their superior firepower to neutralize the threat before it could escalate. This was the nature of modern warfare. It was no longer about individual courage or strategic genius. It was about the coordination of resources, the ability to move quickly, and the power of industrial might. The Japanese had been outmatched not just by better trained soldiers, but by an entire military machine that operated with incredible efficiency. And this is what made the Marines such a formidable force. They were more than just soldiers. They were a product of America's industrial power, a force backed by endless supplies of ammunition, tanks, planes, and of course, artillery. The Japanese, on the other hand, were fighting with dwindling resources, struggling to maintain their defensive positions as the American war machine ground them down. As the Marines pushed forward, the Japanese commanders realized they could no longer rely on their traditional tactics. The Marines weren't like any enemy they had faced before. They were relentless, systematic, and overwhelmingly powerful. There was no escape. The Japanese tried to delay the inevitable, hoping to inflict as many casualties as possible. But they knew in their hearts that victory was beyond their reach. And so, the battle continued. The Marines kept coming, pushing forward with the same intensity, the same determination, and the same unstoppable firepower. Each day, the Japanese soldiers were faced with the reality that their defenses were crumbling, that their positions were being destroyed by the relentless bombardment of American artillery. But still they fought on, knowing that their survival depended on it. But the question remained, could the Japanese ever find a way to stop the Marines? Could they ever overcome the overwhelming power of American artillery and stop the relentless advance of the U.S. military? The answer, unfortunately for the Japanese, was no. The Marines had simply too much firepower, too much coordination, and too much resolve to be stopped. As we look back on these battles, we can only marvel at the sheer power of American artillery and the Marines' ability to utilize it to devastating effect. The Japanese soldiers, for all their bravery and determination, were simply no match for the combination of tactics, technology, and industrial might that the United States brought to the battlefield. If you've been captivated by this story of military power, determination, and strategy, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to discover, and you don't want to miss out on the full story of the battles that shaped history. As the battle for Iwo Jima unfolded, a brutal reality began to set in for the Japanese defenders. The initial shock of the Marine assault began to wear off, replaced by a cold realization that they were up against an enemy that was not only relentless, but also infinitely adaptable. The Marines' tactics, reinforced by the firepower they could bring to bear, were like a tide that never receded. With every advance, the Japanese defenses crumbled further, and the Japanese soldiers were forced to retreat deeper into their bunkers and tunnels. But even in the face of this overwhelming firepower, the Japanese resistance did not falter immediately. The defenders fought with the same intensity that had characterized their earlier engagements. They knew they were facing an enemy who would never relent, who would continue pushing forward no matter how many casualties were sustained. This unwavering determination created a tension in the battlefield, one that echoed the desperation of the defenders, but also highlighted the Marines' unbreakable resolve. What made the battle for Iwo Jima even more harrowing was the terrain itself. The island, with its jagged volcanic sand dunes, rocky outcroppings, and labyrinthine network of caves and tunnels, was an unforgiving environment. The Japanese defenders had turned this inhospitable landscape into a deadly maze of interlocking defensive positions. It was a fortress, a stronghold built with one purpose in mind: to delay the inevitable and inflict as much damage as possible on the advancing Marines. But the Marines had their own advantage, an advantage that came not just from the firepower they had on hand, but from the sheer scale of their operations. Unlike the Japanese, who were operating with limited supplies and stretched resources, the U.S. military had an industrial machine that was capable of sustaining an unrelenting assault. Each Marine, no matter how far in the trenches they were, was backed by a vast support system that could provide ammunition, medical care, food, and fresh troops when necessary. The American industrial war machine, which had been churning out tanks, planes, artillery, and ammunition at an unprecedented rate, was something the Japanese could never match. While the Japanese were fighting with dwindling resources, the U.S. Marines had a nearly unlimited supply at their disposal. The sheer weight of this industrial power made any defense seem futile. No matter how hard the Japanese fought, the Marines could continue pushing forward, absorbing casualties and regenerating their strength with ease. The intensity of the battle reached its peak in the final days of the assault. Japanese forces, knowing they could no longer stop the Marines, began to shift their tactics. Rather than defending in fixed positions, they began to rely on their last-ditch strategy, taking the fight to the enemy in brutal banzai charges, hoping to take as many Marines down with them as possible. These final desperate attacks, while causing horrific casualties on both sides, did little to slow the relentless advance of the U.S. forces. In the end, the Marines prevailed. But the cost was steep. Over 6,000 Marines died in the battle, and more than 19,000 were wounded. For the Japanese, the cost was even higher. Of the 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest were killed in the fighting, many of them to the last man. The scale of the casualties was not lost on anyone who had witnessed the battle. The Marine Corps was a machine of war, a relentless force that could push through any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. But even the Marines had limits. They had paid a terrible price to take Iwo Jima, but in doing so, they had achieved something remarkable, a victory that would forever be remembered as a testament to their resolve, their training, and the overwhelming firepower that had supported them throughout the fight. The battle for Iwo Jima was one of the most grueling and devastating engagements of the Pacific War. The Japanese soldiers who fought there were some of the most dedicated and disciplined troops in the world, but they were ultimately outmatched by the sheer scale and power of the American military. What had started as a desperate hope for the defenders to hold off the Marine assault for as long as possible became, for many, a futile act of sacrifice. The Marines' ability to continue fighting in the face of unimaginable losses became a symbol of American military power. It wasn't just about courage. It was about commitment, industrial might, and an unwavering belief that victory was always within reach no matter the cost. The Marines had been trained to fight, to endure, and to never stop moving forward. And when they landed on Iwo Jima, they didn't just fight for victory. They fought for the memory of every fallen Marine, every objective taken, and every inch of ground gained. The Marines' success at Iwo Jima had a lasting impact. The island, strategically located between the Japanese home islands and the U.S. forces advancing toward them, became a crucial stepping stone in the Pacific campaign. Its airfields, once controlled by the Japanese, were now in the hands of the United States, providing a vital base for future bombing raids on the Japanese homeland. But the battle for Iwo Jima also revealed the true cost of modern warfare. It showed that even the most well-fortified positions could be overwhelmed by the combined forces of American firepower and military resolve. The Japanese had fought with incredible bravery, but in the end, their defenses had been crushed by the unrelenting power of the Marines and the industrial might of the United States. As we reflect on this historic battle, it's impossible not to be struck by the bravery of the Marines and the cost of their victory. The lessons of Iwo Jima are still relevant today, as they remind us of the importance of preparation, training, and never underestimating the power of an adversary. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is the recognition that war is not just a contest of strength and tactics. It's a battle of wills. And in the case of the U.S. Marines, their will to win was unmatched. If this story of military endurance and the relentless pursuit of victory has captivated you, make sure you don't miss the rest of the journey. Hit that subscribe button now and stay with us as we explore more incredible stories of bravery and strategy from history's greatest battles. There's more to come and you don't want to miss it. The Marines' relentless advance through the Pacific left the Japanese with no room to breathe. Every strategic position they set up seemed to be destroyed within hours or days. They were constantly caught off guard, struggling to adapt, while American forces seemed to only grow stronger, more organized, and more relentless. In these final battles, such as the ones fought on the island of Iwo Jima, it became clear that the war was no longer just a battle of strength and tactics. It was a contest of wills. For every American Marine who fell in combat, there were reinforcements who arrived swiftly to take their place. Every fortified position taken by the Japanese was just another step forward for the Americans, not a sign of their victory. Japanese soldiers would fight, die, and then be replaced by new recruits. But the American forces had something that the Japanese simply couldn't overcome: an endless supply of soldiers and materials. They didn't just have more bodies. They had better logistics, better technology, and more powerful support weapons. At Iwo Jima, the Japanese forces were led by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a seasoned commander who knew that the traditional methods of defense would be futile against the relentless American assault. Kuribayashi understood that there would be no victory in the conventional sense. His mission was not to stop the Americans. That was impossible. The goal was to delay them, to inflict enough casualties to make the Americans reconsider their strategy. He dug in his forces deep, into a complex network of tunnels and bunkers that spanned the island. Every position was designed to be hard to crack, with fire lanes set up to channel Marines into killing zones. Kuribayashi knew the battle would be brutal. He knew that many of his men would die defending the island, but he also knew that each day they held their ground would buy precious time for the Japanese leadership to prepare for the eventual invasion of the Japanese mainland. Despite his preparations, there was a certain inevitability about the situation. The Americans had overwhelming numbers and resources, and no amount of determination or firepower would change that fact. The real question was how long the Japanese could hold out before the inevitable happened. On the first day of the battle, February 19, 1945, the Marines landed. The Japanese forces, waiting in their defensive positions, unleashed a massive barrage of artillery fire, hoping to stop the Marines in their tracks. The beach turned into a killing field. But the Marines didn't stop. They kept advancing, fighting. Through the hail of bullets, rockets, and mortar fire, the sounds of war were deafening. Explosions rocked the earth, flames rose from destroyed tanks, and the cries of soldiers mixed with the clattering of machine guns. But amidst this chaos, the Marines continued to push forward. They didn't retreat, even as the bodies of their comrades piled up on the beach. The Japanese hoped that the overwhelming force would eventually break their resolve, but it only strengthened their commitment. One Marine, Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto, had been on the front lines of the battle since the early hours of the invasion. As a Japanese soldier, Yamamoto had been trained to view death as the highest honor. His training had taught him that the ultimate sacrifice was to die in combat, for the emperor, for the country. But as he witnessed the relentless assault by the Marines, something within him began to break. The Marine soldiers, despite being heavily outnumbered, fought with a ferocity that stunned him. They didn't just fight, they endured. They continued their assault even when they were covered in the blood of their comrades, even when they knew the chances of survival were slim. It was a commitment that went beyond anything Yamamoto had been trained to understand. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Marines had no intention of stopping. They fought with a coordination and resilience that the Japanese defenders had never faced before. The attackers didn't hesitate when faced with enemy fire. They didn't wait for orders to advance. They pushed forward, no matter the cost. It was as if they were part of a well-oiled machine, a force that could not be broken by bullets, bombs, or any obstacle that stood in their way. The Japanese defenders, on the other hand, were being slowly worn down by the constant pressure. In the heat of battle, it wasn't just the sheer number of Marines that was overwhelming. It was their ability to adapt and keep pushing forward. American artillery supported the infantry with deadly precision, while tanks and flamethrowers burned out entrenched positions. And the air support was constant. Bombers flew overhead, dropping explosives that shattered the earth and made the Japanese defenses tremble. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this battle was the psychological toll it took on the defenders. Every time they thought they had stopped the Americans, they would rise again, more determined than ever. They were a force that didn't know the meaning of surrender. The Japanese were facing an enemy that would not stop until they had completed their mission. And that mission was clear. Take the island, no matter the cost. The Japanese soldiers, accustomed to fighting for every inch of ground, could not comprehend how a fighting force could continue to push forward when faced with such devastating losses. They were used to the idea that battles could be won or lost, that sacrifices were made, but the Americans didn't care about the cost. They were relentless, and the Japanese knew they could not match that relentless spirit. Private Tadashi Yamamoto, who had been watching the battle unfold from his position, began to feel the despair of his situation. With every Marine that fell, more seemed to take their place. The defenses he and his comrades had worked so hard to construct seemed to vanish before his eyes. It wasn't just the firepower of the Marines that overwhelmed them. It was their sheer willpower. The Americans refused to accept defeat. No matter how much they bled, they continued to push forward. For the Japanese defenders, this was a horrifying realization. They had been trained to fight until their last breath, but now they were facing an enemy that would do the same, but with an unending supply of resources, soldiers, and determination. It was no longer about the number of soldiers on the battlefield. It was about who could outlast the other. As the battle wore on, the Marines made their way deeper into the Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese soldiers fought bravely, as they always had, but it was clear that they were being outmatched. The battle was becoming more like a massacre than a conflict. The American forces were no longer just fighting for victory. They were fighting for total annihilation. With every passing hour, the number of Japanese defenders dwindled while the Americans pressed on. The battle became a war of attrition, and the Marines were better equipped to endure it. The Japanese defenders, on the other hand, had no choice but to fight until they could no longer stand. Finally, on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of intense fighting, the battle for Iwo Jima was over. The Japanese had been overwhelmed. Of the 21,000 defenders, only 1,000 remained alive, most of them too wounded or unconscious to continue fighting. The American casualties were heavy as well, with nearly 7,000 Marines killed and over 20,000 wounded. But despite the incredible loss of life, the Marines had taken the island. It was a bittersweet victory. The cost had been immense, but the strategic value of the island was undeniable. Iwo Jima was a vital point in the American campaign to defeat Japan, providing a base for air operations that would ultimately lead to the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. In the aftermath of the battle, the psychological toll on the Japanese forces was immense. They had fought with courage, but they had faced an enemy that could not be stopped. The Marines had proven that no matter how hard the battle was, they would never stop fighting until the objective was achieved. It was a realization that struck fear into the hearts of the Japanese soldiers who survived, and those who fought on subsequent islands. The Battle of Iwo Jima, along with the Marines' ability to continually push forward, would become legendary in both American and Japanese military history. It was a symbol of American determination, the unyielding spirit that would see them through the war. But for the Japanese, it was the painful realization that their sacrifices could never be enough to defeat the overwhelming might of the American military machine. The battle for Iwo Jima would go down in history as one of the most intense and hard-fought confrontations of World War II, a testament to the will of both sides and the incredible sacrifices made on that small, volcanic island. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a grim testament to the brutality of war, a place where both sides faced unimaginable sacrifices. As the final waves of fighting came to an end, the Marines looked upon the island, now a scarred battlefield, and the true cost of victory began to sink in. For the Japanese defenders, Iwo Jima marked the end of their hopes for victory in the Pacific. But for the Marines, it was a victory that came at a staggeringly high price, one that would resonate throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. It wasn't just the loss of life that made Iwo Jima so significant. It was the brutal, unwavering resolve that both sides exhibited in the face of death. The Marines, with their relentless assault and iron will, had demonstrated a fighting spirit that was unbreakable. They pushed through every obstacle, every trench, every fortified bunker. They fought not for glory, but for a cause greater than themselves, to secure a foothold in the Pacific and to pave the way for the eventual defeat of Japan. The cost of this victory, however, was staggering. As the Marines planted their flag atop Mount Suribachi, a moment immortalized in history, the island was far from conquered. The brutal fighting continued even as the iconic image was captured. Japanese resistance, though weakened, did not stop. Bunkers still held their ground and snipers picked off Marines from hidden positions. The reality of the battle was far from the picture of triumph that many in the outside world would come to associate with the victory. Private First Class Tadashi Yamamoto, who had been among the defenders, felt the weight of the situation as his comrades continued to fall one by one. The Americans, despite their heavy casualties, had not lost their will to fight. Yamamoto watched in disbelief as Marines continued to charge forward, their faces a mask of determination and anger. Every time they were stopped, they found a way to advance again, using firepower, strategy, and an almost unnatural resilience. It seemed as though the Americans had an unending supply of resources, soldiers, and willpower. The more they lost, the more they gained. The battle had no clear end in sight. Yamamoto, like so many of his fellow soldiers, was raised with the idea of dying honorably in battle. The concept of surrender was foreign to him and many others in the Imperial Army. But as the days wore on, and the realization of defeat began to sink in, Yamamoto's belief in the samurai ideal of never surrendering began to falter. It became clear to him that the Americans were not only brave but also had resources, technology, and sheer numbers that far exceeded anything Japan could muster. The Japanese were fighting for survival, but the Americans were fighting for domination, and they would not stop. The Marines, despite their own heavy losses, were not bogged down by the casualties. Their strategy was simple yet devastating: keep pushing forward. Their tactical advantage was the ability to absorb casualties and continue fighting without missing a beat. This was something the Japanese could not comprehend. While the Japanese struggled with shortages of food, ammunition, and reinforcements, the Americans had no such issues. They were supplied constantly by air and sea. A Marine who fell would be replaced by another within hours, while the Japanese defenders, isolated and cut off, had no such luxury. As the battle neared its conclusion, Yamamoto and his fellow soldiers faced a terrifying realization. The Americans could keep coming, no matter how many they lost. The Japanese had calculated the cost of every American life. The loss of a Marine was a tragedy, but it didn't stop the onslaught. For the Japanese defenders, each fallen comrade meant one less chance to win, while for the Marines, it was simply a cost of victory. This brutal arithmetic marked the true turning point of the battle. Yamamoto's final moments on Iwo Jima were filled with a mixture of disbelief and dread. He saw the American forces closing in, the Marines never wavering, never stopping, the constant bombardment, the smoke rising from explosions, the horrific sound of guns and grenades. It all blurred together in a symphony of war. His comrades had fought bravely, but now there were too few of them left to hold the line. The constant pressure from the American forces was like a wave crashing against a shore, slowly eroding the last remnants of resistance. The final days of fighting on Iwo Jima were a desperate attempt by the remaining Japanese defenders to hold out, to delay the inevitable. But the Marines, ever relentless, never slowed down. The strategy of overwhelming force combined with an unyielding will to win had proven too much for the Japanese. They were fighting not only against men but against a system of war that was far superior to anything they had experienced before. As the Japanese bunkers were cleared one by one, the Americans began to take control of the island. For the Japanese, every position lost felt like another step closer to their doom, and yet, they continued to fight with the honor and courage instilled in them by their training and culture. They were facing an enemy that had no fear of death and no hesitation to sacrifice whatever was necessary to achieve victory. The final American assault on Mount Suribachi marked the end of organized resistance from the Japanese defenders. But it also left the Marines with the painful realization of the cost of their success. In the end, nearly 7,000 Marines had lost their lives. Over 20,000 had been wounded. The Japanese defenders, however, had paid the ultimate price. Only a few hundred survived out of the 21,000 who had once held the island. The death toll for the Japanese was devastating. For the Japanese survivors, the aftermath of the battle was a bitter one. They knew that their sacrifice had been in vain. Iwo Jima was lost, and with it, the last hope of turning the tide in the Pacific. But they also realized something more profound. Fighting the Marines was not like fighting any other enemy. The Marines were a force unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered before. They were not just soldiers. They were an unstoppable force, driven by an unyielding belief in their mission and the support of an entire nation. Private Tadashi Yamamoto, in his final moments, wrote in his diary that the Americans had proved what he had feared. Their resources, their will, and their resilience were unmatched. The Marines will win, he wrote, not because they are braver than we are, not because they want victory more than we do. They will win because they have everything they need to win, and they will use those resources without mercy until we are all dead. The words written by Yamamoto, like those of so many other Japanese soldiers, captured the tragic reality of their situation. They had fought with everything they had, but they were up against a force that could not be defeated by courage alone. The battle for Iwo Jima, with all its bloodshed and sacrifice, had become a symbol of the overwhelming might of the American military machine. It was not just about bravery, it was about the total domination of modern warfare, a combination of training, technology, and industrial might that left their enemies with no way to counter it. As the Marines finally secured the island and the Japanese resistance came to an end, it was clear that the lessons of Iwo Jima would be remembered for years to come. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, it was a lesson in humility, a bitter realization that courage and sacrifice could not win a war against an enemy who could afford to lose soldiers and still have an unyielding will to keep fighting. The Battle of Iwo Jima, like so many other battles fought during World War II, demonstrated the shifting nature of modern warfare. The Marines showed that no matter the cost, victory could be achieved. And the cost, as evidenced by the high casualty rates, was tremendous. Yet for the Americans, it was a victory that was worth every sacrifice. The symbolism of the flag raised atop Mount Suribachi, forever immortalized in photographs and history, would stand as a reminder of the resolve of the American military and the price of their victory in the Pacific. To wrap up this intense story and make sure you don't miss any more gripping insights from history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. So make sure you're subscribed and ready for more content that dives deep into the untold chapters of history. If you found this story about the Marines' relentless spirit and the fierce battles of Iwo Jima impactful, drop a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Every bit of feedback helps us bring more stories that matter right to your feed. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more incredible content coming your way.